Welcome to Brown Bag History for September 28th, 2022. Today we're talking about the highway to Sicamous, which was opened 100 years ago this summer. As we start, we acknowledge that the land around Revelstoke and on the Columbia River and its tributaries is traditional Sinixt territory. We acknowledge the ties of the Sicamous, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and the Ktunaxa to this land. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land, sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So, of course, there were indigenous trails throughout the Eagle Pass, going back centuries. There was a tote road that was built during railway construction by Gustavus Blinn Wright, who was a well-known BC road builder during railway construction days of the 1880s. And then, of course, the rail line went through in 1885. But it wasn't until 1922 that there was the first highway that was built through. Just to let you know, the photographs don't entirely match up with my words. I didn't have any photographs of the original construction of the highway, so I've just put together photographs of the area that will just sort of play them as I'm speaking, but they don't entirely match my narrative. Sometimes the photos we have just don't match up. So this is a photograph showing Three Valley Lake in 1905, and you can see at the left the railway line and the tunnels, but of course there's no highway visible on this side. There was obviously activity out in that area sort of through Eagle Pass. There were settlements at Malacqua and Craigellachie and even Clanwilliam, and the big Mundy Lumber Company sawmill was built at the west end of the lake in 1905, and it was there until the teens when it burned down and ceased operation, or they had a big fire in the mill yards and they ceased operation of the mill, and it was eventually torn down. So there's obviously activity in the valley. This was the Rutherford home at Three Valley. This was the brother of Jock Rutherford, who lived in town, was a railway engineer. And after the mill went out of operation, they still had a lot of equipment and buildings there. And Mr. Archie Rutherford was the caretaker of the site after that time. So in May 20th, 1920, tenders were called for the completion of a provincial highway, including a section of the Revelstoke West Road. Here's a photograph of Summit Lake, and about 1910, originally part of the railway line went on the side of Summit Lake that the highway is now on, and they rerouted it around between 1903 and 1904 onto the side of Summit Lake that it is now. But in this photograph, if there had been a railway through there, I'm not sure exactly where it went. But the accounts that we have say that it was originally on that side of the lake where the highway goes through now. In June 30th of 1920, it was announced that work was started on the 19-mile stretch of the West Road, yet to be completed, to put Revelstoke in touch by road with the outside world. And this week, a couple of gangs of men have been put to clearing the right-of-way for the graders and rock workers. So the camp has been started across the lake from Three Valley Station, and also one at Clanwilliam. And it is expected that at least 100 men will have headquarters in each camp. The contractors hoped to be able to secure sufficient men to rush the work to completion before the fall. So whenever they were doing a project, they always announced it would be done that year. That never happened. So this is 1920. By March 17th, 1921, there was an announcement that a lot of the grading had been completed. The contractor was Angus McDonnell, and his road superintendent was Major K. Alexander. Now, I was assuming that he was a World War I major, but I haven't been able to find any information on him, either in the Soldiers of the First World War database or the Vital Events Index. Ken was speculating that perhaps he was a British major and then had come to Canada afterwards, but so I don't really know much about him himself. But Major K. Alexander was the superintendent for the work, and he announced in March of 1921 that the work of grading had been completed to Three Valley, except for a small amount of work clearing the creek channel near mile 11. Said the section of grading just completed is the heaviest work on the line and included heavy rock excavation along Victor Lake and along the shore of Three Valley Lake. It said since work started in June 1920, there have been nearly 500 men employed on the line at different times, the average force being over 100 men. So the turnover was nearly 5 to 1. That of the men employed, about 30% have been returned soldiers and nearly an equal percentage of local people. It was actually a requirement of the contract through the government that preference for hiring went first to returned soldiers and second to local men. It was also the policy of the contractor to buy supplies locally wherever possible. And 97% of the supplies had been purchased in Revelstoke. So it was a good boon to the town. Major Alexander stated that the work west of Three Valley would be started by the 1st of April, but not sooner due to snow and other conditions. And they were hoping to hire 200 men for that section. Said the grade being completed to Three Valley, it only remains to construct the bridge over the CPR at Clanwilliam to open the road for traffic as far as Three Valley. In April of 1921, they did announce that they'd started work between Three Valley and Taft. The J.P. Johnson was the resident engineer, and contractors were ready to establish the camps. The wages were actually the wages that were being offered were less than they'd offered the previous year. They were offering $3.75 a day for ordinary labor, $4 for axemen, and then others were proportionate, but didn't really give the amounts. By May, they had cleared the right of way from Taft to Three Valley. The J.L. Ferguson, who was the Dominion Highway engineer at Ottawa, was in the city that week and was greatly impressed by the work that was done at that time. So May of 1921, there was a headline in the paper saying Revelstoke West Road to have best possible grading. Mr. McMillan, who was an expert locating engineer, was going over the entire line to adjust the line to the topography of the ground. And they would do final adjustments once the right-of-way was cleared. The newspaper said there will be some delay in starting grading, but this delay is fully justified by the improvement in the line and grade that is possible after the clearing has been done. It was expected that grading would be started within a few days and rushed through with all possible dispatch. They were, in July of 1921, they were building bridges at Clanwilliam and Three Valley with large forces of men on the job. The bridge at Clanwilliam was to be about 210 feet in length, and the bridge at Three Valley about 125 feet. So by April of 1922, they were really trying to push the highway through, and announced that $18,000 had been appropriated to complete the West Road. There was just 3 miles left to complete. Said all new work in the district will be surfaced at an additional cost of $12,000. So by July, they were making plans for the opening of the highway, and the plan was to do the opening ceremony at Malaclaw, in between, on August 17th. The secretary of the Malaclaw committee for the opening, a man named J.M. Humphrey, wrote that the opening of the road is going to mean a new era to the entire district, from Revelstoke south to Penticton and west to Kamloops. And from a tourist standpoint, will mean to the country just what the people living in that great district are big enough to make it. So the people of Malacor are few in number, yet they are entering into this official opening with a will that assures it being the most successful event of the kind ever held in the interior. And they were expecting up to 1,000 people to go there for the event. And the CPR was planning on offering special passes for those who didn't have automobiles to get there. So on July 26, 1922, it was mentioned that the first trip had been made over the new road, which was completed but not officially opened yet. So Roy Law of Revelstoke left the city on Friday, July 14th, picking up engineer Smith at Taft and Sandy McRae at 22 Mile Camp, who accompanied him to Sicamous. Then he went on to Kamloops. He returned said he left the Monday of the previous week at 6:45 p.m. and arrived in Revelstoke 8 a.m. Tuesday. Left Kamloops the Monday of the previous week. So his mileages and his times were Kamloops to Vernon, 72 miles, 3 hours and 30 minutes. Vernon to Armstrong, 14 miles in 40 minutes. Armstrong to Enderby, 10 miles in 30 minutes. Enderby to Mara, 14 miles in 50 minutes. Mara to Sicamous, 12 miles in 50 minutes. Sicamous to Bowie, 8 miles in 30 minutes. Bowie to Taft, 24 miles in 1 hour and 35 minutes. Taft to Revelstoke, 26 miles in 45 minutes. And the total was 180 miles from Kamloops to Revelstoke in 10 hours and 30 minutes. And he actually received free service at the McLaughlin service stations at Kamloops and Vernon because of the novelty of his trip. August 17th, 1922 was proclaimed a civic holiday in Revelstoke, and stores would be closed to allow as many people as possible to go to Malacor for the opening. The Revelstoke brass band was to be in attendance, and there was a whole slew of politicians that were planning to speak, which I'm sure made everybody happy. So the dignitaries were to return to Revelstoke in the evening for a dance at the drill hall, which is now Trans-Canada Fitness. CPR was arranging for rail cars to transport those unable to travel by automobile. They were offering $2 round trip fare if tickets were purchased before the morning of the 17th, and it would be full fare after that time. The contractor, Angus McDonnell, was telling people to don't delay the work. And said the road was open only to Taft at that time. Said any attempt to go further west than Taft is dangerous on account of blasting and other construction operations now going on between Taft and the North Fork of Eagle River, east of Kergalaki. The delaying work was taking a chance of personal injury. Said cars actually required the assistance employees to get over what he was calling portages. So the enthusiasm of the public in desiring to use the road as soon as possible is commendable, but they are defeating the very purpose that we are all working for. That is the opening of the road on the 17th of August by attempting to get over the road with cars before it has been officially opened. And employees were actually instructed not to give assistance to motorists who were disobeying signs not to travel on the road. So I guess they'd helped carry a few cars over some of these divots that they couldn't get by, but they were being told not to do that to discourage people to travel. Yet people were traveling, and the first outside car to reach Revelstoke arrived at the city at 7 p.m. on August 3rd. Mr. and Mrs. H.A. Sampson of Spokane motored from Vancouver, and they'd left there on July 30th. The trip from Vancouver was 684 miles long. And at that time, they were having to go back down into the States and back and forth a few times. They had gone from Vancouver to Everett, Washington, and then to North Bend over the Snoqualmie Pass, then to Wenatchee via the Blewett Pass, then to Oroville, Washington, and then to Penticton and up the Okanagan Valley to Vernon and on to Revelstoke. It was announced that Harry Buse had lined up, of Revelstoke, had lined up 40 automobile drivers for the trip on the new road to the opening on the 17th. And it was described as, the road was described as, without exception, the best, prettiest, and most scenic drive in the interior of BC. And it is in the pink of condition, with the stones raked off and level as the floor. It mentioned that Major K. Alexander deserves much credit for the way in which he has pushed the work ahead in readiness for the opening. Last Sunday, he, together with J.B. Mackenzie, C.R. McDonald, the local druggist, Jack Daly, and Drennan Holton, motored out as far as Taft, planting signs slow around some of the corners and erecting painted signs at the various lakes en route, namely Griffin, Victor, Summit, Three Valley, and at Alexander Falls, the latter named after the genial major, who has taken a great personal interest in the falls and is spending private means to enhance their beauty. So K Falls, just past Enchanted Forest, are named after Major K. Alexander, but they initially called them Alexander Falls. And I'm not sure at what point they changed it to K Falls. Maybe somebody decided that Alexander was too long of a name. So that's where K Falls gets the name from. So the big ceremony was held on August 17th. And at present at the ceremony were two witnesses to the driving of the last spike in 1885, Tom Wilson, who was the discoverer of Lake Louise and a contractor on the railway, and Pat Gallagher of Nelson. There were more than 100 automobiles there. 40 of them were from Revelstoke and the rest from the Okanagan. And you can see the cars lined up in that photograph. You can see there's also a little archway and some little gazebos and tents that they've set up for the event. There were 800 people there in total. There was good weather. Recent showers kept the dust down and eliminated smoke caused by recent bushfires. Following the speeches, the formal declaration of the opening of the road was made by the procession of the autos, led by the Premier and Minister of Public Works, passing through a cedar arch, which marked the division of the road east to Revelstoke and west to the Okanagan. And back in that photograph, you can see the archway there in the middle of the photo. People had returned to Revelstoke for a reception and dance at the drill hall, and they had a dinner at the Scandinavian Hall in shifts. 600 people were fed, 100 at a time. There was a description of the trip to Malaqua. Said no one of the nearly 200 citizens occupying the 40 cars who motored to Malaqua will ever forget the magnificent trip. Had the arrangements for weather conditions been made to order, they could not have been better. The atmosphere was wonderfully clear and with no smoke or dust to mar the pleasure of the 34-mile trip. All along the route, the scene was ever changing. The lakes looked inviting, glittering in the sunlight, while Caves Falls were pronounced by everyone a wonderful sight, even in the mountainous section of BC, where more or less of this kind of thing can be seen at any time. You notice they're already calling it Caves Falls instead of Alexander's Falls. The road, for the most part, especially going out, was exceptionally good, but the large number of cars going over it could not help but cut them up to some extent. But the ruts were rapidly filled in along the line by men deputed for that purpose. So the highway was open, and there was a note in the August 23rd issue of the newspaper saying, among the visitors to the city last week were Mrs. H.A. Fraser and daughter of Armstrong. Miss Fraser, it is believed, is the first lady to drive a car from Armstrong to Revelstoke over the new highway in a remarkably good time of 5¼ hours. On Friday, she drove up Mount Revelstoke as far as the Prince's Post. which had been unveiled by the Prince of Wales in 1919, and returned to Armstrong the same day, after both ladies had expressed their unstinted praise of the local scenery and the condition of the mountain road. They hope to return in a few weeks, when they will make the acquaintance of the Big Bend, Greeley, and South roads. While in the city, they were the guests of Mr. and Mrs. Hart Monroe. Just after the highway was opened, Mrs. Len Howson, accompanied by Mrs. Dr. Hamilton, were planning to leave Revelstoke on August 20th for Vancouver, Seattle, and Point South, making the trip in Mrs. Howson's coupe. They would be the first two ladies to make the trip to the coast over the new auto road from Revelstoke. So also want to show the pictures of some of the bridges, or the Revelstoke bridges, that were in use during the life of the highway in its early days. This was the first traffic bridge in Revelstoke over the Columbia River, from Revelstoke to the Big Eddy, and the approach was at Wright Street, a block south of where the current Big Eddy Bridge is. This was a wooden bridge that opened in 1910. So that was the first traffic bridge. And then there's everybody's beloved Big Eddy Bridge. The iron workers are March 25th, 1924, and the bridge opened the summer of 1924. So in 2 more years, that bridge will be 100 years old. So during the days of the Highway West, and then the Big Bend Highway, which opened in 1940, this was the highway bridge that was being used for the Big Bend Road and the West Road. And the current bridge opened in 1961, the Trans-Canada Highway Bridge. This was directional sign. This is the corner of 4th Street, looking down that way, and Mackenzie Avenue. And you can see the directional sign there to Kamloops, Vernon, and the Big Bend Highway, and Mountain View Park pointing in the other direction, which is now Queen Elizabeth Park. An ad for a Ford automobile, local dealers. So it was, the highway opened on August 17th, 1922. On September 2nd, 1922, there was the first fatal car accident on the highway. It was, the headline said, "Terrible Death by Drowning of Mrs. T. Steed and Miss Lister." It was a party of 6 driven by Mr. Donald Adams, who was the fiance of Mrs. Steed's daughter, Lida. They were heading for the Okanagan to spend Labor Day when the car went over the embankment into Summit Lake. The newspaper said it was with light hearts and with the anticipation of a most pleasant trip that the party, consisting of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Steed, Miss Lida Steed, and Wilmot, together with Miss Lister and Mr. Donald Adams, were heading for the Okanagan, Penticton being the destination of all, with the exception of Miss Lister, who was on a visit over the holiday with her sister at Summerland. The party had proceeded along the old abandoned CPR right-of-way to a point nearly to the end of the lake, when in turning out to pass a car driven by Mr. H. Shotton, fisheries overseer of Kamloops, the turnout was made somewhat wide, which brought them pretty near the bank, the latter giving way under the weight of the car, allowing it to slide gradually into the water. The bank at this point is about 7 feet high, and the depth of the lake is said to be about 40 feet at the place where the car entered the water. In the front seat of the car were Mr. Donald Adams, Miss Steed, and Wilmot, her brother, and in the back, Mr. and Mrs. Steed and Miss Lister. The car itself immediately sank, carrying with it the bodies of the 2 unfortunate women. Mr. Shotton and his son Allison went immediately to the rescue and assisted the 4 to safety, while Allison dived several times in the hopes of finding those who had gone down. Mr. Adams refused to leave the water till he was exhausted. Assistance was phoned for to the city, and Dr. J.H. Hamilton, Chief Spratt, and Provincial Constable Markland accompanied by Miss Nelson, nurse, hastened to the scene of the accident. All efforts to locate the bodies by grappling proved of no avail up to Sunday evening. J. Donaldson and T.W. Allen, divers from Victoria, arrived on Tuesday. They brought Mrs. Steed's body up within minutes, but they could not find the body of Miss Lister after diving for 2 days. They believed that a slide had occurred below the water, and they did bring the car up as well. Miss Steed was 50 years old, native of Brockville, Ontario. She came to Revelstoke in 1897 to join her husband, who was working in a store on Front Street. And they left their daughter and son Wilmot. And Lida did marry Donald Adams, who was her fiance at the time. Miss Lister, whose body was never recovered, was the matron of Queen Victoria Hospital since 1918. She was about 28 years of age and the daughter of Reverend D. and Mrs. Lister of Nanaimo. They came to Revelstoke in May of 1917 from Vernon, or she came to Revelstoke in 1917, from which place she had graduated as a nurse a short time previously. And there was an inquest into the accident, and Donald Adams was charged with driving too fast for the conditions. And I believe he was going about 20 miles an hour at the time. So that was the first of many accidents on the highway. There was also a note shortly after that it said, making the run from Malacca to Revelstoke in 2 hours and 5 minutes is a fast one, and was accomplished last Thursday in a Ford car containing DJ LeBeau, Mrs. J.E. LeBeau, and daughter H. Erickson and Miss Louise Blaze. The party remained over until Tuesday to take in the Labor Day events at Recreation Park. And also mentioned that the longest trip taken by Revelstoke citizens was when Mr. and Mrs. J. M. Holding of 4th Street were to travel to California with their guests, Mr. and Mrs. Sampson. This photograph is showing the first bus that was put in service between Revelstoke and Kelowna in 1931. Then in the 1942, there were work camps for Japanese men that were created as part of the Japanese internment program during World War II. They opened the camps in the spring of 1942, and they had camps at Three Valley, Taft, Griffin Lake, Solsquequamby, and all throughout there. Over the course of from between 1942 and 1944, there were up to 500 men working in the camps. And I won't get into too much detail about this because I recently gave a talk specifically on the work camps, and that's up on our YouTube channel, so you can find more information about that particular program. It was probably the first sort of major upgrade of the highway since it had been opened. There was a lot of work done on the highway at that time. Most of the men who were working were young Japanese men, most of whom had been born in Canada and were Canadian citizens. Some work, these photographs are from the albums that were put together by some of the young Japanese men who worked in the camps. And I just have a few pictures showing some of the buildings throughout the past. As John, or Jock Rutherford, as he was known, was a retired railway engineer from Revelstoke, and he moved out to Three Valley, and they had a little farm out there, and he had a Chevron station there as well. This picture was taken probably around 1950 by Earl Dickey. That's where the little area called Rutherford Beach, that's where that was. And a picture showing the Three Valley Lake in around the 1960s. And you can see that's at the bottom of the hill. So Three Valley Gap would be over here. And there was areas built up there. There was actually, for a while, there was an area, sort of campground and hotel called Gayland Park at one point. I just recently came across information on that. And there's during the Gulf Service Station, motel and campground at Three Valley around the 1960s. And Three Valley Motel, when it was first opened in the 1960s, rather different looking than what it looks like now. It just started as a little small motel, and then they started adding in bringing in older buildings for their ghost town, and just kept building and building and building into what it is today. But there's its rather humble beginnings. There's from Gordon Bell. And there's Enchanted Forest around 1965. Enchanted Forest was started by I think it was Doris and Ernest Needham, and she just was making these little statues and wanted to sort of create this little fantasy area, and it's just grown from that to the point where you drive through and in the middle of summer and it's just jam packed. It's nice to see that it's still in operation and still so popular. So that's the West Road. The next talk is going to be on October 12th on Queen Victoria Hospital, because the first Revelstoke Public Hospital was opened in 1902. So I thought I'd do something I'm doing a lot of anniversaries, so I thought we'd do the 120th of the first public hospital in Revelstoke. So thank you for joining us today. I just